if a lot of Chinese people accept that the US is an enemy, which most Americans don't feel that we are, well, then people-to-people relations suffer. And that also hurts the relationship. So I'm unfortunately pessimistic in thinking that, yes, that propaganda matters and it can be self-reinforcing and it doesn't bode well for the future of US-China relations.
I'm elated to get to welcome to the show Dr. Chris Carruthers. He's not only the Deputy Director of East Asian and Pacific Studies at the Foreign Service Institute, he's also recently been named a China Fellow at the Wilson Center. And if you're not familiar with Chris's work yet, I guarantee you will be. He's really one of the most exceptional researchers of his generation on East Asia. So I'm really excited to get to welcome you, Chris.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for that too generous introduction. I appreciate it. Great to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about your project that you're doing at the Wilson Center on China. I understand that you're going to be studying anti-Americanism in China. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated this project and what you hope to learn?
Sure. Well, so this is a project about how America is being portrayed by Chinese state media to Chinese people. And I'm very interested in what is being said about America, not just at the surface level of what today's news is, but really what the takeaway is supposed to be, how Chinese people are supposed to be thinking about America according to the Chinese government, and how that has changed over time, how Chinese government messaging about America has changed over time. And to do that, I'm looking at two very authoritative sources of the Chinese Communist Party's opinion on America. One, the People's Daily, leading newspaper, of course, and the other is the Xinwen Lianbo, the nightly news broadcast in China on CCTV. I think this project is important to do for a few reasons. One, propaganda tells us what the Chinese Communist Party thinks to some extent. Not everything people say, not every government statement is believed by everyone in the government. Nevertheless, it represents a real opinion in the party about the general view of the United States. So that's one thing to understand better. A second thing is these messages, they have impact. They have impact on the country. They trickle down through the media environment. Not everyone is reading the People's Daily every day or listening to the Xinwen Lianbo every day, but those statements, those editorial lines, they are very clearly trickling down into other state media, informal media, and even the opinions that Chinese citizens post on the internet. So that's a second reason. Finally, I think this is an important study to do now because this anti-American sentiment that's being expressed in Chinese media has boomed. We've seen an upsurge in anti-American messaging from around 2018, 2019. And this is not a mystery. We know this is happening in the context of US-China relations deteriorating, but nevertheless, I feel that we shouldn't just wave propaganda away. I think we should be systematically looking into what is being said and what it means. So I'm very excited about this project.
That's great. So, so you told us a little bit about why it's important, and there's no doubt that it is communicating the Chinese government position to the Chinese public and filtering down. But why do you think that there is this sea change since 2018 or so, as you mentioned, in the Chinese messaging?
Yes, well, I think the most obvious answer is US-China relations have gotten worse, right? US-China relations have gotten worse. Trump launched a trade war. President Trump launched a trade war. China began to feel more threatened. It lashed out with negative propaganda, calling America hegemon, pointing to all the negative things America does in the world. And so that's one reason. There's a lot of research, academic, scholarly research showing that anti-Americanism is useful for authoritarian governments because it kind of shifts the blame for things going wrong, and it makes America an enemy to the people, at least in theory, and that allows the government to get some public support. That's the easy answer. But what I want to draw out here is that there's probably a second answer too. And that's that when we look at this boom in anti-American rhetoric and messaging, it started at a time when the Chinese Communist Party began facing important internal challenges, right? Internal challenges like people questioning Xi Jinping's consolidation of power, right? In early 2018, when China got rid of the presidential term limits, that was like a big red flag, not just for foreigners watching China, but for Chinese people, right? Chinese people know, even if they're somewhat supportive of the government, they know that a leader shouldn't stay in power forever. And this started to raise some fundamental questions about where their country's headed. At the same time, you get declining economic growth, right? Which is the big thing that the Communist Party has been relying on and saying is proof that it's a good government, right? So when you have that story starting to falter and new questions about the politics, attacking America can be useful, right? Attacking America and pointing out the flaws in the American system and setting up this comparison can be a way to help the party bolster its self-image and bolster that national confidence that Xi Jinping is always talking about. Get that confidence in our system, in our path forward in this new era in which China is a great power. Yeah.
So the Chinese government's facing certain headwinds, if I may try to paraphrase, both on the economic side and on domestic political legitimacy side of things, and so they've decided to scapegoat America increasingly. Is that a fair summary?
I think that's right, but it's not even just scapegoating. I think you also have to see a different use of anti-Americanism where they set up a comparison and say China's better. Right. And that's different than scapegoating. Saying, things are going bad here at home, but it's America's fault. That's one thing. But to actually start to give a positive message and say, look at us in comparison. Look at, for example, COVID. COVID was a big test, according to Chinese state media. It's a big test. Every country faced the test. China did the best and America did the worst. Right. When you put it like that, that's not scapegoating America. Although there is some of that going on, that's saying our system is better than America. So there's, they're trying to turn it around that way. And that I think is also behind rising anti-Americanism.
So there's a very interesting scholar on North Korea, if I may, Sandra Fahey, who's written about North Korean human rights issues extensively, about how the North Korean propaganda has used whataboutism, she describes. And so whenever there's a critique of the North Korean human rights, they turn around and try to critique American human rights, maybe talking about race relations in the United States, things of this nature. Do you find sort of a similar theme in the Chinese propaganda?
No doubt, no doubt. I definitely see a lot of whataboutism when China can't defend its record on its own terms, right? When China's caught, it can't defend its record on its own terms, it pivots to whataboutism. And Xinjiang-related propaganda is a good example because initially, the Chinese government denied that there were these camps in Xinjiang and that so many Uyghurs were being detained. But then when that wasn't feasible to maintain, it pivoted to say, well, look at what the US does to its minorities, right? The US has all sorts of human rights violations. It does not have the standing to criticize us. Right? That's definitely a thing. But I see in this recent upsurge, really three themes of anti-Americanism, right? And that's interesting because it's not just one thing. It's not just America's bad, right? It's sort of one, America is a dangerous hegemon. America's foreign policy harms China. America seeks to suppress China. That's a common theme. But then there's also a second theme. America has bad morals, bad values in its society. It has human rights violations, racism, gun violence. And many of these things are true, but they take it to an exaggerated, prejudicial place that makes it really anti-American. And that's sort of a second narrative that they can use to compare to make their country look better. And then a third thing is this narrative that America's in decline, that America used to have it, but now it's lost it. And that, look at the chaos in America's political system. The polarization is getting worse and worse. Globally, America used to bully everyone, but now other countries don't want to be bullied anymore, right? But who's there to fall back on? China. China, the responsible power, will pick up the pieces. And so you get these three distinct narratives. America's a bully. America has, moral value problems. Its society is not very successful. And thirdly, it's in decline. It's getting worse. And so all three of these are being promoted at the same time. And I think that's worth keeping in mind, that the anti-American propaganda isn't a monolith either.
Are all these three themes new since 2018, or were there elements of this before as well? How can you help us understand what has changed besides the quantitative nature of the amount of criticism, but the qualitative nature of it as well?
Sure. None of these narratives is entirely new. The theme of America being a hegemonic power, that's as old as the hills. That's been something since the Mao era, using different words. The imperialism has been swapped out for hegemonism. That's still there. America's society has value problems, also not new, also very old. The narrative that America's in decline, though, is really only 10 or 15 years old, right? It has this theme that began around 2008 with the financial crisis, saying, wait a minute, America's having a lot of problems. And then there was the election of Trump, and it looks like America's political system is more chaotic than usual. And then COVID hits, and this narrative just explodes in Chinese media. So you see a big rise of the America's in decline narrative as a relatively new thing. But like I say, none is new. What this surge really represents, or the overall change, is in, like you say, the frequency of anti-American editorials. There's about one a week now in the People's Daily that really hits America pretty hard. And that's more coverage than any other country gets, from China's media. And then also the stridency of it, the tone of it, right? There have always been criticisms of America, and not all criticism is anti-Americanism, but the tone has gone to a really negative place, and even mocking place, where, China says that the empty slogans of the American politicians satisfy no one, and democracy is a joke, and that it's just increasingly flailing and is desperate. And so the system can't govern America anymore, or something like that. So you get this really exaggerated rhetoric mocking America for thinking it's number one, that you don't see that much 10 years ago. And in my study, I look at about 20 years of data, reading through the People's Daily editorials from the early 2000s. And in that time span, you can see that this is a change in the frequency and the stridency of anti-Americanism.
That's very interesting. So you mentioned at the outset that that these high-level pieces that you're reading are filtering down through the other media outlets in China. Can you tell whether or not these messages are having an effect on the Chinese public? Is it resonating?
Right. That's a really important question. And I wish we had the tools to give a perfect answer, but there's always a lot of opaqueness in a highly censored media environment, and you're not clear who believes what. That being said, one thing I did was I looked at Chinese social media posts on Zhihu, which is a question and answer website, sort of like Quora in America, that's very popular. And I read the 100 top posts in recent years about America. And these are clearly not things written by officials pushing propaganda, but they receive real upvotes and support from netizens. And when you read those top 100 things about America, you see a lot of overlap with what the narratives are in the People's Daily. So the narrative that America's foreign policy is, hegemonic and really mean-spirited toward China, absolutely, you see it. The narrative that America has problems, so deep social problems, like America's really unsafe, that's a very big theme. So Chinese people considering going to America, they feel that. That being said, I do see a lot of pushback on the theme that America's in decline. So that does not always seem to persuade Chinese people. I see some really highly upvoted, highly respected argumentation on the Chinese internet that pushes back and says, is America in decline? Doesn't seem like it. Seems like a lot of immigrants still want to go there. Seems like it has a lot of allies on its side in supporting Ukraine. Seems like its economy is doing fine. So I'm not sure that Chinese people are buying that narrative, right? But this is all sort of anecdotal evidence of the best kind that I can give, but not a full accounting of Chinese views, unfortunately.
Yeah, the American to decline narrative in China is interesting to me, because in a certain regard, you think that they would want to make the argument that America is strong and therefore America is a threat to China. So do they try to play it both ways? Do they try to say America is both in decline and a threat to China?
Absolutely. And you put your finger on it there precisely, because 10 years ago, that would be the argument that America is really powerful and that's why China needs to watch out. But now the argument is that America, because it's in decline, it's lashing out, right? So why is there US-China conflict? Nothing that we did, nothing that China did, right? It's because the US feels threatened by us because it's flailing. The US is falling, and as it falls, of course, politicians like Trump emerge to blame China. And so this, I think, it helps them explain why there's US-China tensions and also gives China a free pass. And that worries me, because if Chinese people come to believe that, then it kind of feels like nothing China does could rectify the situation, right? If your opponent is attacking you because of something going on with them, maybe there's nothing you can do to improve the situation. So that's a worrying turn that I see in the propaganda. Yeah. So
maybe last question, if I may, on this particular issue of whether or not you think there's a self-reinforcing effect. That is, I think you've established very well that the Chinese government is pushing a greater anti-American line. I think it's fair to say that there's been greater tensions in the U.S.-China relationship, and the Chinese as well have pursued a harder line towards the United States. Does the Chinese propaganda to its own people encourage it to take a further harder line towards the United States?
I think it very likely can. And some people might disagree because they feel that propaganda is just propaganda and the Chinese government doesn't even necessarily believe everything they're pushing. But at the same time, because this propaganda has real effects and actually persuades at least some Chinese people and actually is resonant with the same as what some officials believe, it matters. The scholar Jessica Chen Weiss wrote a book about nationalist protests in China, and she said that nationalism is like a tiger, and there's a Chinese saying, when you're riding a tiger, it's very hard to dismount. So when the Chinese government uses this nationalism and whips up the idea that America is a threat, it then finds itself in a position where its actions have to be at least somewhat consonant with what it's saying, right? So that's one thing that's possibly constraining China's future actions. Another is that if a lot of Chinese people accept that the US is an enemy, which most Americans don't feel that we are, well, then people-to-people relations suffer. And that also hurts the relationship. So I'm unfortunately pessimistic in thinking that, yes, that propaganda matters and it can be self-reinforcing, and it doesn't bode well for the future of US-China relations.